Namaste and grace and peace to you. I decided to add that one, at least just for this episode. You never know. I might feel differently next time, but I always like namaste. That's always a good one. That's a good greeting to have. So we are in episode 3, and this is X Communities, and I am hoping, I've got an agenda. Let's just dive in. Let's just do that. So a couple of kind of reminders that I'm going to go really quick with. This is best experienced, at least in my opinion, these videos are best experienced at 1.25 or 1.5 speed. So my suggestion is to speed these up. I like to speak a little bit more slowly so that I can choose my words carefully. And in just a minute, I'm going to share with you 2 words that I didn't choose carefully in episode 1, but we'll talk about that really quick. But please listen to these videos at 1.25 or 1.5. The second thing is, I hope you have a journal and a pen. I use index cards. That's my fancy journal. You know, they work. But have something to write down your reflections, your questions, anything that kind of comes up. Number one, as you read any scripture that you are studying or watching videos like this, and write down some notes so that you can meditate, so that you can reflect, so on and so forth. And I think doing it in pen and doing it even in script, if you can do that, is probably best. I know psychologically, in terms of research, you're going to make the most brain connections if you're writing in script and probably in a pen and paper. So just keep that in mind. Now, there were 2 words in episode 1. One I am really concerned about, and one was just a small mistake. It's probably not a really big deal. In fact, it's really not a big deal. Let's start with the one that's not a big deal. How about that? So the one that is not a big deal is I stated something to the effect of, I do not believe in a literal Satan. And then I added, like a few seconds later, I said, and that's why I don't believe in a Satan archetype. And that statement is incorrect. So I want to correct this here. So an archetype is a model. It's like a perfect model of something. So when I say an archetype of Satan or an archetype of evil, we have plenty of those. And I certainly believe in archetypes. I certainly believe that there are models that we hold up. There are symbolic models that guide us. And I'm going to call these archetypes, at least right now. Now, the other one was much more problematic for me, even though I don't even know how many people would have caught it. But it's going to cause a problem if people really watch and critique episode 1. I had made the statement that the culmination of the 66 books of the biblical canon, if you're Protestant, or the 71 if you're Catholic, that the combining of those books, the selection of those books, was arbitrary. And I use the term arbitrary, and the term arbitrary is completely wrong for this process. I'm not an expert, and I'm not a biblical scholar in the sense of how this all came together. All right, so that's one thing. The other thing I want to remind you of as I keep talking about the Bible is, a lot of times I talk about this is because, number one, I'm most familiar with this particular wisdom tradition, the wisdom tradition of Christianity. But again, I want to be careful with using that word because there are a lot of reasons not to even like that word. And I'd probably agree with a lot of those reasons. But when I said it was arbitrary, here's what I was thinking. I think that it is very important. Let me think about how to say this. Sometimes, here, let me put it this way. Sometimes if something happens and we end up with a product, sometimes the question isn't, why is all of this a part of the product? Sometimes the question is, well, why doesn't the product do this or this or this? Or what was excluded from the product that, in other words, we have this product, right? We have this thing called the biblical canon. And it somehow took all of these scriptures from a specific place in a specific time, from a specific group of people, mainly religious leaders, people who had knowledge of this stuff. And my questioning really throughout my life is, why not more? Why not more? What was left out? And as I have studied all of the stuff that was left out, I have just seen bigger themes, and I've seen, I don't like the term bigger God because it just sounds kind of cliche, and we already have that problem, at least in a lot of religious traditions where, our God is bigger than yours, and I don't know. I don't like it when religions get into pissing matches. It just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But what wasn't included? And there are so many gospels, for example, that were not included, and they're Gnostic gospels. I couldn't sit here and argue with you about why they weren't included and why other gospels were included. All I can tell you is that I have read some of the Gnostic gospels, and they're absolutely beautiful. Particularly the Gospel of Thomas. I think the Gospel of Thomas is one of my favorites. And there are so many other pieces of writing that a lot of Christian pastors and priests will use in reference to the biblical canon. So when I said arbitrary, I was more kind of not frustrated, but I was more trying to critique the the narrowness of why certain things were included. And I can understand it somewhat, but it's not my area of study, so I'm not sure. But just like X communities, here is the deal: it doesn't matter. And I know people, I know some people just heard that and they probably, oh my goodness. I have so many friends, and I think if they hear this, what are they thinking? Here's my point. Here's why I'm going to keep saying it doesn't matter to so many of these things. I think we have to consider other people's viewpoints, and I think we have to consider other people's perspective, and I think that we can even agree to disagree on so many of these things. But once this baby that we introduced in episode 2, once this baby starts growing and teaching and modeling what life should look like, how we actually have to embrace some suffering and pain. Once we start seeing that, then when we look at that model, when we look at that archetype, when we look at what I am going to continue to call, the point where it was a full incarnation of X, a full incarnation of, quote, God, unquote. When we see that, we're going to look back and we're going to realize, kind of like, who cares? This is what I think we need to focus on, type thing. It's about keeping the main thing the main thing. So in the end, this particular argument, even though I made a mistake, and I apologize, and hopefully that clarifies a little bit, I just want to say, in the end, it's not going to matter, because the direction, the trajectory that this story is going to hopefully impact people in a far different way than individuals who are sitting around debating whether you ought to have 66 books in the Bible or 71, whether you can have a good life following the Bhagavad Gita or the Tao Te Ching or the teachings of Buddha or the Quran or the Bible or the New Testament or the Old Testament or the et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I want to continue to make the argument. Let me show you my incredible drawing here. I want to continue to make the argument that when X incarnated through this process that I have drawn here in different times and different periods in human history, that there is a certain incarnation in Hinduism, there's an incarnation in Buddhism, there's an incarnation in, of course, Christianity. Merry Christmas, right? There's an incarnation in the Prophet Muhammad. All of these are different types of incarnations of X that I am suggesting are for a specific people in a specific time. And we can argue which one is better or worse, and we can make all of our points, and we can, like I said, we can have a pissing match about whose religious figure is the greatest. We can do all of that. And in the end, I think we're going to miss the point. In the end, I'm going to say if you study and you pattern your life, I'm going to go back to my base here. If you study and you pattern your life after Rabbi Jesus, if you look at just him as an archetype of God, as an incarnation of God, your interpretation of everything else is going to fall in place, and you are going to find yourself perhaps not really concerned about all of the religions on the planet, all of the philosophy. You're not going to find yourself concerned about it because you are going to find a way of life that I think is going to, well, if I can be really ballsy and say it, you're going to find a way of life that you might consider salvation. But please keep in mind, when I use that word, when I use so many words in here, I'm not referring to it in the same way that is found in a lot of the traditional, more, especially the traditional, well, traditional is a good word, the more traditional churches. All right, so this is not about converting you to Christianity. I want to keep kind of beating that drum because I don't want anybody watching these videos, anybody who are thinking about making some of these communities just to be together, to live together, well, maybe not to live together, but to be together and to do life together. There, that sounds a little bit better. It almost sounded like I was going to tell everybody to go find a compound and put a deposit on a piece of land and, build a building, but that's not where we're going. But I'm also not being, what's the word? I'm not pulling any punches here. I have no desire to convert people to a certain religion because, quite frankly, when I look at people who are converted to different religions, even beyond the Christian one that I'm going to refer most to, I just don't see a lot of change, and I think it's very clear in 2025 when we look around at what's happening in our well, I almost stepped on my own feet and went into a political statement, but anyway, let's keep going. So back to the agenda here. Also, please keep in mind, I really do want you to do this with 2, 3, 4, 8, 9, 10 people. I don't know that I would go above 8 or 9 people, but certainly you could organize it in such a way to do it different. But remember, I am asking you to consent to not only jumping into a bowl of spaghetti, but I'm kind of asking you and a group of individuals, no matter what religion, to kind of lock arms and just say, we're going to look at the life of Rabbi Jesus. We're going to look at a lot of what he taught. I would love for every group to go out and find a Hindu and a Buddhist and a Muslim to join your group, because I think that you would be surprised at what they would bring to the conversation, particularly if you're from more of a Christian tradition. So I am trying to organize these X communities in a way that it's just going to be, it's going to be a journey of taking care of each other, but it's also going to be a journey of keeping the main thing. And I think that you're going to see a lot of these other religious traditions come through the teachings of Jesus in the book of Matthew. All right. So let's keep going here. I'm going to grab a drink here. All right. Excuse me. So we are in verse 19 right now. So this is taking time right now, but it is not going to take as much time as we continue to move forward. The other thing is there are some parts of this book, these 28 short chapters, that I still don't know what to make sense of. And so I'll give thoughts, but a lot of this is just going to take time and reflection. And sometimes I think about something and it just kind of starts coming into focus a little bit, and I get all excited that I might have figured something out or whatever, and then it just kind of disappears. So sometimes that's just a function too of, considering something that doesn't make sense and trying to find, what's going on. So verse 19, now let me pause this a minute. All right, I think we're recording again. Sorry about that. I paused it just so I could off a little bit. So, and I discovered how to pause this, which is going to be really nice. So, verse 19 is Joseph. So let's talk about Joseph. And more specifically, I just want to give you some ideas about what kind of man I think Joseph was. Remember, all of this is meant to hopefully enrich, give different perspective on this story that you should be reading. So if you're spending time in the book of Matthew, please just spend some time, read a little bit, and then if something kind of catches your attention, meditate on it. And if it takes a day or two to meditate on it, I want you to stop there and I want you to meditate on it. So all of this is just ideas to give you different perspectives. So Joseph is a really interesting character. And Joseph, I would probably say Joseph strikes me as a very good man. And this is regardless of what you think about Mary. Because in I think it was episode 2, I had suggested that there are all different ideas about how Mary became pregnant. And we know them. All of us human beings, we know them. So there is certainly, the idea that perhaps Mary got pregnant with Joseph. And it certainly wouldn't be uncommon today for teenagers to have sex outside of marriage. And the other thing that we suggested is because Joseph seemed a little bit surprised by this, I also suggested, I'm not going to say we, I also suggested that maybe Mary was with somebody else. And then there is the possibility, because the 2 examples that I just gave, I'm sure are okay with my scientist friends, but now my friends who believe in the virgin birth, I also explained how I think this is very possible. I don't have evidence. I don't have anything to indicate that it needs to happen this way. I certainly don't believe that, if you don't believe this particular part of something, that somehow you just have to throw the whole story out. I think that argument just doesn't work for me. But if you go back here, so my scientist friends, remember one of the suggestions I made is that before there was matter and energy, if there was nothing, or kind of like if you take a spaceship and go to the end of the universe, what is there at the end of the universe on the other side? It's like to some extent we have to live with the mystery. And if one can believe that something before can incarnate in such a way, whether it's energy in the Big Bang, but it can incarnate in such a way that suddenly there's matter and energy. If you can believe that something changed to produce matter and energy, then I have to believe that it's also possible for X or the Christ or the essence or whatever you want to call it to incarnate the timeline in different ways. And certainly it would be possible. I mean, if something can incarnate itself into all of the matter and energy of this universe, then can we at least live with the mystery or the possibility that something might incarnate itself fully in an infant? So I think that this is something just to consider. And for me, I love living with the mystery. I don't think I'd have it any other way. I don't think I'd want to be an individual who sits around and says, I have it all figured out. In fact, we're going to talk about how that's problematic if you sit around and you feel like you have it all figured out. Let's see, I think, that might have to be the next episode. But anyway, so Joseph, regardless, was a good man because he lived in a culture where, number one, if his fiance shows up and she's pregnant and then she has the baby and somebody does the math, all sorts of problems could occur. And he even had it in mind to, I think some of the texts say divorce her, so they did get married, or dismiss her, for example, from their from their engagement. So regardless of how you interpret it, Joseph chose to stick around. And I want to talk about this a little bit because there were 2 other things involved here. There was an angel that told Joseph something. And I'm going to spend quite a bit of time talking about this angel. And also, the text says that Joseph was a righteous man. So I want to talk about this term righteous. So let's start with, well, let's just go in order. Let's start with righteous. And then I think, the angel shows up in the next little section. But let's talk about righteous. So Joseph was a righteous man. This term, righteous, okay, I don't have to go into the Greek. I don't have to go into the Hebrew. I don't have to, I don't have to. It's, what does it mean for somebody to be righteous? And in my mind, there is this truth that all of us know we're not perfect. We all know we're not perfect. I don't know anybody who would say, I'm perfect. And I think we have to look at this term righteousness, like what makes a righteous man righteous. And it's not that that man was perfect. And we need to get this kind of off of our radar that somehow we have to be perfect. Because I think when you set this standard up for yourself that you have to be perfect and you can't make a mistake, I mean, talk about setting yourself up for a life of guilt for not measuring up or shame for not being perfect. And I think we have to avoid some of these terms. I think we struggle too much with some of these terms. And here's what I'm going to suggest a righteous man is. Here's what I'm going to suggest what made Joseph a righteous man. And I think, when I think about Joseph, I think about my wooden Joseph in my manger scene that I have up around Christmas time. When I think about Joseph being a righteous man, what I think about is that his heart was pointed in the right direction. He wasn't perfect, but his heart had a certain trajectory. And we know people like this. We know people that you can almost predict the decisions that they're going to make because there's a certain consistency, there's a certain pattern. And even though they're not going to be like 100% perfect on the straight and narrow, putting every foot in front of the other foot just absolutely perfectly, and they're never going to have a problem, those people just don't exist. But good men and good women and good kids typically do have a trajectory of good in them. It's like the feeling I get sometimes when I meet with a client. Like sometimes I meet with a client and I just in my gut, I have this feeling like this is not going to go well. This is not going to go well. The trajectory is way in the wrong direction, and this is just not going to end well for you with the path that you're on. And hopefully, I'll have a relationship with that client enough that I can start kind of putting ideas out there about, how can we do this better, and it's really important. The other thing is this. So righteousness is a trajectory. It's your heart and your mind and your gut, if you will, are pointed in the right direction. And yes, there's going to be times you sway off the path and you get back on the path, but it's more about the overall movement than anything else. Now, perfection, however, perfection is an archetype. And so we do have what we would call the perfect archetype. So we kind of know what is perfect in our mind, and we have an archetype of what is perfect, and we still work toward that archetype, but we're also graceful to ourselves, and we're also graceful to others when we stray off that path or when we make a mistake or when we mess things up. So perfection is an archetype. And the other thing that I want to say is this, and I just thought of this today. So again, this is something where I may change my mind. I may change my mind before bed tonight. Who knows? That's just kind of how my brain works sometimes. But I realized something. I realized in this perfect archetype that sometimes we wear our imperfection as a badge of honor. And I don't think that we should do that. And I'm going to suggest, at least in X communities, if you decide to do something like this, if you decide to follow something, if something works for you, if you discover something, I'm going to say, stop being humble. Don't be humble. Don't negate who you are. Don't do anything like that. Yes, accept that you're going to be imperfect, but also have confidence if you have that trajectory in your life. Because humility is, well, not humility, being humble seems to be somewhat fake in my mind. I think it was Nietzsche who had this idea. Now let me see if I can even get this right because this is just coming up. But it was Nietzsche who had this idea that sometimes individuals who go around and they act humble, it's actually like a false ego layer that people put on. It's a false persona, if you will. Individuals who go around and and seem to be so humble, and it's almost like somebody coming up to you and saying, "Oh, you're going to find that I'm very humble." Well, as soon as you say that, you're not being humble. You're covering something up. So there's a problem there. Now, that is very different than humility, practicing humility. All right. So I want you to be honest with who you are. I want you to be proud of who you are. And a good example is this. I don't want you to how do I say this? I feel like I'm stumbling over my words here a little bit. So let me just take a second here. I may even pause it, but I want you to be confident that you are a child of God. I want you to be confident that God loves you. I want you to be confident that X has things under control, whatever that is. We'll call it God. I want you to be confident that you can walk through this life day to day, and you can hold your head up and you can put your shoulders back and you can be proud that you are a child of God. And I think that that is really important that we do that. And no, I don't think if you do that, somehow you're being full of pride and you're going to, pride goeth before a fall, or suddenly you're doing the same thing Lucifer the angel did. That's not at all what I'm saying. But there is something about being childlike in your presentation to the world that Jesus really valued. And he said, "Come to me like a child. Come to me like in a childlike, innocent state," that I think is really quite beautiful. And I think, if you think about it, you know, children will just run up to you and hug you if they know you, right? And they may be shy at first or whatever, but there's a confidence about children when there's love and acceptance and things like that. And I think more people have to be proud of that. I think we need to quit feeling guilty and quit feeling shame about not being perfect, because I know I'm not perfect and you know you're not perfect, and X or God or whoever knows you're not perfect. It's not a secret. But that doesn't mean that you can't stand up straight and you can't say, "I'm a child of God. This is who I am." So please take that into consideration. The way I put it here is practice humility, but stop being humble, if that makes sense. Humility is serving others. Like, you can be confident in yourself and you can serve others in humility. That, I think, is what we're getting at. So what we're getting at is, I want you to be confident in who you are. I want you to find who you are. I want you to be proud of who you are. I want to be confident in who you are. But then what I want you to do is I want you to go wash somebody's feet. I want you to go serve the individual that you may just be disgusted with. That's what I want you to do. Now, let's keep going here. Don't disgrace. Yeah, Joseph didn't want to disgrace her in public. So even though he could have dismissed her and he could have divorced her, and it would have been, I guess, totally following the law. I'm not totally familiar with that. But again, I think he was a good man. And I think it was because of the trajectory of his heart, made him a good man. It was not that Joseph was perfect. So let's keep going with the story here. So at one point, Joseph thinks about divorcing her, and then it says something like an angel comes and says, "No, don't worry about it. Take Mary as your wife, and what is conceived in her is of the Holy Spirit," something like that. So, man, I'm getting excited for Christmas now. Here I am in my house. I'm looking outside, and my Halloween lights are up. I have orange and purple outside, but those will turn to green and red when Christmas gets closer. But anyway, um, the angel of the Lord says, "No, take Mary as your wife, because what's conceived in her is of the Holy Spirit." So let's talk about this, and I want to give you again just all different perspectives on this, on what is this angel, and I'm going to give you all these perspectives, and the same thing I'm going to say, it doesn't matter, because we have yet to see this infant grow up and actually begin to model and teach us what we can do to have a full life. So angels and devils. The best example I'm going to start with, the best example I can give you is the angel on one shoulder and the devil on the other shoulder, and the two are kind of whispering in your ear when you have a decision to make. And that is the idea of an angel being like the voice of conscience, the voice of reason. And I think that's a very good possibility. I think sometimes when people hear voices, you can say, "Thank goodness an angel helped me out here." And I suppose if you trip up and do something horrible, you can say, "The devil made me do it." Not too sure I'm quite a fan of that one, because that seems to me to be kind of passing the buck and making an excuse. But we do have this idea of voices of conscience, and conscience, and voices of reason. And I believe that this is one of the aspects of becoming fully aware that happened in the Garden of Eden, in that particular legend. And also, what I can say is at some point, evolution would have had the primates, our common ancestors, humans' common ancestors. At some point, yes, they would have become conscious, very conscious and fully aware, but they also would have became moral. And I think that this is really important too. There had to have been a point when humans first came around where we realized something, where we realized, for example, that when we got hurt and it caused us physical pain, particularly if another person hurt us and caused physical pain, we also realized that we could cause physical pain, and we could actually choose to cause physical pain to another human being, or we could choose not to. That's the idea of conscience. And at some point, that had to be well enough developed that humans became quite separate from the rest of the animals and the rest of creation, and that we were able to truly sacrifice ourselves for other human beings if we so wanted to. And this is a really important concept, because I'm not sure to what extent we see this, for example, in the animal kingdom. I don't know that we see an organism or some species sacrificing themselves when there's really nothing in it for them. And yet human beings can do this. Human beings can pay the price, so to speak, of other human beings. Human beings can choose to step in and give their life for somebody else, even individuals that they don't even know. All of this is possible in human beings on a level that we don't see in other areas. And a lot of that comes from this idea of conscience. And conscience can be the proverbial devil and angel on the shoulder. Conscience can also be the voice of X. So you could look at it that way too. Certainly, if X can incarnate in matter and energy, if X can potentially incarnate in an infant, well, X can also certainly incarnate in you as a thought and as some sort of a a compass or some way of giving direction or critique, things like that. So that can be conscience as well. So we have that. Are those things of conscience? Are they actually the voice of God? And once again, yes, there is a lot to be said scientifically about how genetically, how we get genes from our parents, from our grandparents, great grandparents, from our ancestors, from the original human beings. I mean, it gets passed down to us genetically, and there is something to be said about how sometimes our morals and our character is also sent down genetically, but there's also a lot that we learn from our environment, from our first families that we had, the first gods we experienced, and our parents or our caregivers. So there's also all of that going on as well. But the idea is that it doesn't matter. It can be the angel and devil just whispering in your ears, and maybe that is based on your genetics and experience of other people, how you were raised, and maybe that is the voice of God saying, do that or don't do that. And maybe that is a type of X incarnating into you in order to help give your life a certain trajectory and a certain motion. And all of these, I think, are really important things to consider. Then the next one, and this is really important too, because the angel said, fear not, don't be afraid. Fear not, don't be afraid. At some point, we're going to unpack this, but fear used to be considered a sin. So if you look at the 7 deadly sins, there were actually 9 deadly sins initially. And again, I'm not an expert in this area, but my understanding is, I think it was Pope Gregory the First or the Third or something like that. One of the Pope Gregorys decided to take that particular sin and combine it with something else. And then there was another one that he deleted too, or kind of combined. But it went from 9 to 7. But this is really interesting to me because think about a community where having fear is actually missing the point or missing the mark. Because that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about if fear is a sin, and remember we talked about sin being an archery term of missing the mark. If fear is a sin, and we live in a community where if somebody is fearing, we say, hey, there's a better way to do this. You don't have to keep missing the target with fear. Let me show you how to hit the target. Let me show you how not to sin, which is going to result in not living in fear. This is, again, the trajectory that we're going with. Is I would like to see these communities address who's afraid in your group. What things are you afraid of? What things might I be afraid of? And how does that fear interfere? How does that fear get in the way of having a fully conscious life? And I think that that's a very important question. And I would love to know from somebody, why Pope Gregory got rid of or combined that one particular sin, because now we hear all sorts of things. We hear things like, well, you need to fear God. And I think to myself, well, I'm not sure that you need to fear God in the sense of God is some abusive megalomaniac or whatever. And yes, I know you can probably make the case for that if you look at some Old Testament stories and things like that. I get it. And hopefully, as we unpack this, you'll realize that there's a literal level of meaning. There's all different levels of meaning that you can look at different things. And perhaps God wasn't a megalomaniac after all. Perhaps just some of these stories were not meant to be taken strictly literally, which, yes, there are many stories in the Bible where God just seems to be, I don't know, he just seems to be one unstable, pissed off individual. And I'm not too sure that that's really accurate if you look at things in a little bit different way. So sin, let's see, oh, so fear. So fear not. So fear not. And to actually look at that, but then because we no longer consider fear to be a sin, now we have some of these things being thrown around like we have to fear God. I kind of question that idea of fear. Um, it's almost like instead of fear, it's like have a healthy respect. I don't know, something like that. I'm not sure exactly how to put it, but that's something we'll unpack as we go. Now, the other thing is this. Let's talk about this concept of sin a little bit. And I do hope I'm going to have to listen to episode 2 again because I don't remember if I talked about sin in terms of archery. I think I did. But here's, sin is sometimes considered our passion. So when we're born naked into the world, Carl Jung would say we already know who we are. That's what Carl Jung would say. We already know who we are. And as soon as we get born into the world, we start putting on these ego layers. We start putting on these false personas in a way, or we utilize personas in a way that help us to engage the world. And just like in the story of Adam and Eve, when they found out they were naked, they sewed up clothes for themselves. We do the same thing. As soon as we're born, as soon as we are conscious and we realize how people might be looking at us or how we feel, we start hiding ourselves with all of these ego layers. And our ego layers can also be identified as our passions. Our passions being how we engage the world. And hopefully, at some point, once we mature enough, so once we're born infants and we become children, we go through the teenage years, and I would say into your mid-20s. Your whole life is spent putting on these ego layers. Your whole life is covering up who you truly are. And then something really interesting happens because you start to realize that all of these ego layers you're putting on, all of these personas you're putting on, they just don't work. They're actually covering up who you truly are. They're actually bushels that are covering your light, if you want to put it that way. If the flame of who you are and you put something over top of it, that might be called an ego layer or a persona, and you hide yourself. And these are passions that help us to engage the world as children and as teenagers, and I would probably say into our 20s. But hopefully in our 20s, we begin to realize that these ego layers are just not serving us well. They're actually holding us back. And then that's where some of this work comes, this work of, call it repentance, this work of, I need to do something different. So you come to this conclusion that you're engaging the world in a healthy way. You're covering yourself with personas. You are, in effect, becoming unconscious to being fully alive. And that is, I think, the story that we're going to unpack in a more mystical way with Rabbi Jesus. This is a natural progression. And another thing for you to think about is, was sin necessary? Because look, if God wanted us in this perfect environment where nothing ever happened, by the way, that reminds me, listen to the Talking Heads song. I think it's just called Heaven. Listen to Talking Heads Heaven for a poetic, musical, fun way to kind of hear what I'm saying. But look, the idea is this: if we're designed or created or evolved in some way to be a part of a perfect environment, we wouldn't grow, we wouldn't develop, we wouldn't be in a position to exercise free will. And to that end, I like to suggest that sin is necessary. It is a necessary part of life. It was necessary for Adam and Eve to choose against God and eat the apple. Because if they didn't do that, they never would have woke up. They never would have become conscious to the fact that they were naked. And if they didn't become conscious to the fact that they were naked, then the serpent could have very likely done a whole lot worse, I guess is what I'm saying. Is that at least they had a chance to engage the serpent and realize what the serpent is, and then they get to do the work of their own free will to consent to the process, right? To consent to the process of redemption of the whole thing. So we go back to this idea right here. And again, some of this I don't know for sure. But we go back to this idea of X. So before time, before humanity, before all of the religions, before the Big Bang, before let there be light, there was simply X is what we're calling it. And X incarnates in different ways. For somehow, I don't have this figured out, but I don't know that I have to have this figured out. When X incarnated into matter and energy, that may have actually been the original sin, to take all of X and to trap it in matter and energy and to trap it in a time continuum so that we could kind of be brought alongside of it. And in a strange sort of way, we can actually partner in the redeeming of the whole thing. There's something really beautiful there and that I can't really fully grasp. I don't know that I have to, because I think as the life of Jesus unfolds, I think we're going to see a lot of things come together from Hinduism, Buddhism. We're going to see a lot of stuff come together. But there's something in the big process of this X incarnating and going through all of this. And I want to suggest that at some point at the end of this, everything is going to be redeemed and it's going to be back into this perfect state, but it's going to be some sort of state that is undefined. I'm not sure about that, but the point is, I don't know. I like dreaming about it. I like imagining things like this. So that's kind of I think that's where we're headed. All right, let's go back here. Ultimately, we want to keep working on our guilt and our shame. It's going to keep coming up. We feel so much guilt about what we don't do. We feel guilt about what we do. We feel shame about our own identity. We just look at ourselves and we're kind of ashamed of ourselves. And unfortunately, a lot of this comes from, it comes from the Christian tradition in a lot of ways. We don't find, the level of guilt and shame in, for example, when I was in India. If you said to somebody, do you feel guilt and shame? A Hindu individual would say, well, no, why would I feel guilt and shame? Well, because you don't measure up to God. And they would be like, but I am God in a sense. I am channeling God. I am an incarnation of God. And to some extent, I could probably agree. I do. Well, let me back up because I'm trying to be correct. I do believe that we're all incarnations of God. It's the Quaker idea that the light of God is within all of us. It's the idea of namaste, which is I bow to the divine in you, you bow to the divine in me. But that's very different. That type of incarnation is very different than an incarnation that we can hold up as an archetype and say, okay, look, if X incarnated into the timeline of humanity, this is the way it would look. All of these other incarnations of God, yes, they all carry God within them. But this is the archetype. The archetype of God. If God did show up on earth, Jesus is the way God would look, type thing, I think is what I'm getting at. And there are certainly reasons to learn from Hindus, Buddhism, things like that. Every religion, I think, has its role. And every religion even has information and ideas that have kind of gone to this point where we're at. So, the angel says, take Mary as your wife, because what is conceived of her is of the Holy Spirit. And I want to focus just here on, just for a couple minutes more, then I have to, then it's time for bed. But what is conceived in you, I want you to think about this. what is conceived in you, or what is conceived in her, what the angel said to Joseph. Conception is a sperm and an egg. All right? Conception is a sperm and an egg. And then it says, is of the Holy Spirit. A Holy Spirit is a type of movement, or if it's X, it's a type of incarnation. And so this is one of the concepts that, sometimes people, I don't know, there are certain concepts I think sometimes that people like make fun of. And if you really think about it, it's really not anything that is really that odd. And I think to some extent, the idea that Jesus could be considered fully God and fully human, I don't know if that's that far off. Again, I don't have any evidence for this other than to say, well, if there was a sperm and an egg, Jesus must have been fully human. I think most people would lean toward that explanation. On the other hand, he was born into this world, and so he must have been fully human. And by the same token, he must have been fully of a full incarnation of X, or a full incarnation of God. So it's not really that difficult for a lot of the world to say, well, of course somebody can be fully human and fully God. It's just you're looking at two different things. You're looking at the different incarnations. And so when you look at just the incarnation of matter and energy, the first and second incarnations, you're looking at my physical body. And when you look at the incarnation of the X, you're talking about my spirit, or you're talking about, I don't know what you want to call it, my essence, that is going to somehow continue beyond matter and energy. And so when you start looking at things this way, it changes your perspective on life and how you live. And for me, it makes me want to tell other people, which is what I'm doing, through these videos. So we're going to leave off there, and let's see what else I have to say. I think I covered everything that I wanted to. I hope so, because I think it's time for bed. Well, let's just call this an episode. So this one felt a little bit less focused to me, so I will apologize to you about that. But I hope you still got a lot out of it. And when episode 4 rolls around, maybe I'll take just a slightly different approach and maybe be a little bit more clear about where I want to go. All right. So my email should be in the comments. Otherwise, it's under episode 1 if you want to contact me. And if you are interested in starting an X community where you just use this as a starting point, that's what this is. It's a starting point. That this whole video series is just a big suggestion to say, look, you have all of history and all this stuff going on. You have science, psychology, legend, myth, human history, evolution, creation. You have all of creation, all of this stuff going on. And all I'm saying to you is that can be really confusing. And we are living, I think, in very confusing times. And I just think, it would be helpful for you to give yourself permission to start over. And I want to suggest that you don't start with a church, you don't start with a religion, you don't start with the Bible, you don't start with any other religious text, you don't start with anything other than these 28 chapters of the book of Matthew. So that's my challenge to you, and I hope you have the same experiences that I have had. All right, namaste, my friends.